Hello everyone, Namaste once again. Today's video is about paradigms of learning. We have already been familiar with how perception happens, the sensory processes and attentional processes. All these are psychological processes which help us in learning. Learning also happens along with memory, which will be the next topic. So today's topic is just a brief introduction to the different kinds of learning which happen in animals as well as humans. There have been a lot of psychological experiments on animals which have been again tried on human subjects also to validate about how we learn. Please stay till the end of this video because I will be sharing some previous year's question papers for Chapter 7 NIOS Board, NIOS 12th Standard. So let's begin. I'm going to share my screen with you. Yes. So from simple conditioning to complex cognitive processes, we learn certain behaviors. So how we learn is what we are going to know about today. So psychologists in the early 19th century were very curious about how animals learn. So they conducted a lot of experiments on animals, and this became the basis for behavioral psychology and how we learn. This was conducted with human subjects. So for simple responses, what we will learn is classical and operant conditioning. And to study complex responses, we study about different kinds of learning, which are observational, cognitive, verbal, and skill learning. These are more complicated ways of learning. So the most simple kind of learning is through classical conditioning. This is learning through association. This was first investigated by Ivan Pavlov. He was a Russian physiologist and he was interested in studying about how digestion happens. So Pavlov saw that his dog salivated every time he saw the lab assistant. The lab assistant um, had keys in his hand, and when the dog heard the clinging sound of the keys, the dog would salivate because it had learned to associate the lab assistant with food. So Pavlov noticed that his dog started salivating upon seeing the assistant bringing food even before the food was presented. So this was a very casual observation, but he conducted a series of experiments to understand more about how the dog began to associate food with the sound of the lab assistant approaching. So he conducted his experiment in 3 phases. So the first phase is before conditioning. Here he presented the food in the form of powder, meat powder, and this is called as unconditioned stimulus. The salivation that happens in animals or humans is something natural when we see food or when we have food in our mouth, right? So it elicits salivation, the meat powder, and this is an unconditioned response. It happens naturally. We don't have to condition anybody for that. So the dog, what he did, Pavlov, the dog was harnessed and uh, there was a tube inserted through surgery into the dog's jaw to measure the saliva. This one end of the tube was in the dog's jaw, the other end was inside a glass. And the second phase was when conditioning began. They began to condition the dog. So Pavlov would ring a bell, which is considered a neutral stimulus, just before presenting the food. And they did this for many days. They continued it, the same ringing the bell before presenting the food. And what happened in the third phase was the bell alone triggered salivation even before the food was presented, even though the food was not presented, rather. So the bell became a conditioned stimulus and it produced a conditioned response. So this is how the experiment was conducted in three phases. So we see that the unconditioned stimulus gives rise to unconditioned response. The neutral stimulus, when it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, gives rise to the unconditioned response. And after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus give rise to the conditioned response. We learn in detail about this in the class. So classical conditioning is basically stimulus through stimulus learning, where one stimulus becomes a signal for another stimulus. So this is how we learn certain behaviors through conditioning of this kind. And there are certain factors which determine classical conditioning. So how quickly a conditioned response is acquired by us depends on many factors. One is the time relations between the stimuli. There's something called forward conditioning and backward conditioning. Forward conditioning is the regular kind of conditioning where the conditioned stimulus occurs before the unconditioned stimulus, like the bell is presented before the food. It includes simultaneous conditioning, trace conditioning, and delayed conditioning, which I will be describing in detail in class with examples. It happens now, conditioning happens almost every day in all our lives. So we can think of a lot of examples in our everyday life. We will be discussing all this in class for us to understand the concept better. There's something called backward conditioning where the unconditioned stimulus is presented first and then the conditioned stimulus. The food is presented first, and when the bell rings, the subject has to stop eating. That is backward conditioning. Another factor is type of unconditioned stimuli. There's appetitive unconditioned stimulus and aversive unconditioned stimulus. Appetitive is something that gives us pleasure, like food. So here the conditioning is slower and it requires more trials. But aversive stimuli like shock gives rise to pain. And here the response is established in just one or three trials, one to three maximum, because it is more intense. And next is the intensity of conditioned stimuli. The more the intensity, the faster the subject will acquire the conditioned response. So you need fewer trials in case of high intensity stimuli. So apart from this, there are a lot of other um, subtopics. Now, principles of conditioning, I'll come back to this later. These are key learning processes which are important for us to understand in the case of both kinds of conditioning, which is classical and operant. Now, the next type of conditioning is operant conditioning. So this was developed by Skinner, and here it's basically about consequences. How we learn a certain behavior and how our behavior depends on the consequences which follow the behavior. So here we say that the responses that are given by the subjects, whether it is the animal or human subjects, are called operants. as they operate on the environment. So when we learn more in detail, we will discuss about these terms. Basically, what was it about the operant conditioning? Skinner built a chamber which was called Skinner box. A hungry rat was placed here with a lever connected to a food container. So when exploring the chamber, the rat accidentally pressed the lever and a food pellet dropped. So it took time for the rat to learn that this operant behavior, that when it presses the lever, it is rewarded with food pellets. So over repeated trials, the rat takes lesser time to press the lever. So now the conditioning is complete. The rat has understood that when the lever is pressed, it takes a few seconds for the food pellets to drop, and that's the reward it gets. So conditioning is completed when the rat presses the lever immediately upon placing the rat within the chamber. So here, lever pressing is the operant response and food is its consequence. So there are different types of reinforcement, and there is something called punishment too, to bring about change in behavior. Here we learn a lot of terms like what is a reinforcer. It is something which has a lot of features which affect the course and strength of a response. So there are many types of reinforcement. Then there is number or frequency of reinforcement, quality and schedules of reinforcement. The schedules of reinforcement especially are important. So we learn these in detail. We'll discuss about it in class. But basically, the different types of reinforcement are positive and negative. What is positive reinforcement? Adding a pleasant stimulus to increase the behavior. So when you reward a child, when the child shows desirable behavior and you reward the child feels like doing it again. For example, when a child is helping his mother, the mother pats the child on his shoulder for helping, and the child feels good about it, and the child will want to help the mother again. Negative reinforcement is removing an aversive stimulus to increase desirable behavior. For example, a child has an exam tomorrow and he's watching TV. The mother scolds the child for watching TV instead of studying. Then the child switches off the TV so that the mother stops scolding. So this is removing the aversive stimulus, which is the mother's scolding, and this increases the desirable behavior of the child going back to studies. In punishment also there are two kinds, positive and negative. Now presenting an unpleasant consequence like scolding a child for not doing his homework, you're presenting an unpleasant consequence, that's a positive punishment. Negative punishment is when you remove a reward so that it decreases undesirable behavior in the child, like depriving a child of his favorite food for not completing his homework. Now, in schedules of reinforcement, these are a systematic way of presenting reinforcers to bring about change in behavior. Now, there are two kinds, continuous reinforcement and intermittent schedules, continuous schedules and intermittent schedules. We can understand intermittent schedule in terms of ratio and interval schedule. Basically, if we have to understand what is continuous reinforcement, it's nothing but an example would be the rat. Every time the rat presses the lever in the experiment, operant conditioning experiment, it is rewarded with a pellet of food. So every time it presses the lever, a food pellet drops down. That is continuous reinforcement. Now, intermittent schedules, there are interval schedules and ratio schedules. Interval schedules is based on time intervals, whereas ratio schedules is based on number of trials. Under interval schedules, there are two kinds, and under ratio schedules, there are two kinds, which we will discuss in detail in class with a lot of examples so that there's no confusion for you to understand the concepts. So, to go back to the previous slide for key learning processes, these processes are important. Other than schedules, there are a lot of other processes that we need to understand. So if I have to summarize conditioning, whether it's classical or operant, these learning processes are important, like reinforcement, generalization, extension, and spontaneous recovery. So generalization is when we generalize, like a child who fears a white furry dog is also scared of something that is white and furry, like a soft toy. So organisms will respond similarly to similar stimuli. Extinction is when the learned behavior is forgotten. It becomes extinct. Like when the bell is rung repeatedly without food in the classical conditioning experiment, the dog stops salivating. So basically, learned behavior fades without reinforcement, or if the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, happens in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, then the dog forgets to salivate or forgets the learned behavior. Spontaneous recovery is after extinction, if the conditioning procedure is repeated, the response can be reacquired. It's not like the organism completely forgets the learned behavior. So they say that the greater or the longer the time that has lapsed, the greater is the recovery. So these are key learning processes which we need to know, and it's important for us to understand the concept of conditioning. Now we come to observational learning. This was by Albert Bandura, and he conducted a Bobo doll experiment. Here, children watched a film of aggressive behavior toward a Bobo doll, and this was done in three versions. The first version of the film showed a boy entering the room and playing with the dolls in a very aggressive manner, hitting the dolls and sitting on the dolls and so on. The second version showed the first version, sorry. In all the three versions, the boy was shown to be aggressively playing with all the dolls. The first version, the boy was rewarded for his aggressive behavior by the adults. In the second version, the boy was punished. And in the third version, there was no consequence. The boy was not rewarded nor was he punished. So, after the children were shown, three groups of children were shown these three versions. And when the children were allowed to play with the dolls, they saw that the children who watched the first version were the most aggressive, and the children who showed the who were shown the second version showed um, least aggression, and the ones who watched the third version showed moderate aggression. So here we understand that children learn by watching, right? So observational learning, as it's also called imitation and social learning, because children learn social behaviors by observing others. Research shows that violent TV shows, movies, video games, and music increases aggressive behavior among those exposed. Children usually observe adults and imitate their behavior. They enact their plays and games, and that's why, because children acquire knowledge by watching, performance is influenced by whether the model is rewarded or punished. Parents must always exhibit good habits themselves, because children are watching and they learn what they see and not what they hear or what they are told. The next is cognitive learning. So here, psychologists realized that there are certain cognitive processes which happen during learning. It's not only stimulus response or rewards and punishments. So they said that there is a change in what the learner knows rather than what they do. So there are two kinds of learning under cognitive learning: insight learning and latent learning. In insight learning, Kohler performed certain experiments with chimpanzees, and he saw that especially the chimpanzee Sultan solved complex problems through certain aha moments. What happens is, in the experiment, there was an enclosure in which these chimpanzees were put, and some bananas were hung from the top out of reach of the chimpanzees, and some bananas were kept outside the enclosure, far from the chimpanzees, and they couldn't reach it. And there were some boxes placed in the enclosure and some poles or bamboo poles. So, after the chimpanzees walked around the enclosure for some time, exploring the enclosure, they were so hungry and they wanted to have the bananas, but they couldn't reach them. So they sat down for a while, and when they got up, they all of a sudden reached for the poles. They joined the two poles together and used them to bring the bananas towards them, towards the enclosure, and they even stacked the boxes one on top of the other to reach the bananas which were hung high above. So the experimenter Kohler saw that solutions came in sudden flashes, not just trial and error. And these solutions, once found, were immediately repeatable. They could use these solutions in similar to solve similar problems. So that is insight learning. It happens all of a sudden. Latent learning was demonstrated by Tolman and Honzig, and they said that learning can occur even without rewards. So in their experiment, they had three groups of rats and they had a maze. They made the rats run in the maze, and at the end of the maze, there was a reward in the form of food for the rats. So group one received constant rewards. Every time they reached the end of the maze, they found food, and they saw that this group showed steady importance in the performance. The second group received no food at all, and they showed little improvement, whereas the third group had delayed reward. There was no food for 10 days, but from the 11th day, they received food, and when they were examined on the 12th day, they saw that the rats in this group took very less time compared to the first group of rats to reach the end of the maze. So, what they concluded, the researchers, was that group 3 had built a cognitive map, which is a mental representation of the maze, when they were exploring without reinforcement. So, this latent learning appeared only when the reinforcement or the food was provided. So, you can't see this learning, it is not demonstrated without the reinforcement. So, that is what latent learning is about. So, now we will go to the previous year's questions. This is for NIOS 12th standard. So in May 2025, one marker was asked, which of the following is true for learning? So the answer is learning refers to a relatively permanent change in behavior due to training or experience. So after all this, we have learned about conditioning. We know that it is relatively permanent. Extinction can happen in learned behavior, but with reinforcement, it can come back again. The learned behavior can come back again, right? So this is the answer, relatively permanent change. In October 2024, another one marker, Bunny observes that her mother feels happy when she finishes food. She is forming an attitude through operant conditioning. Why? Because mother is happy when she finishes food. What kind of a reinforcement is this? It is a positive reinforcement, right? Anything, any behavior that is formed due to reinforcement is operant conditioning. So with this, we come to the end of the topic, paradigms of learning. Until the next video, I will see you again. Thank you so much.